Good evening. My name is Jisoo Kim. I'm director of the GW Institute for Korean Studies and Korea Foundation Associate Professor of History, International Affairs, and East Asian Languages and Literatures. I would like to first welcome you all to our Korean War conference this evening. The conference is to commemorate the 70th anniversary of the Korean War. The war broke out on June 25th, 1950. To commemorate the Korean War, the conference was initially planned to have it back on June 11th, but we had to cancel the conference like all other events due to COVID-19. Although there were many obstacles, and I can tell you that, I'm so glad that we were able to reschedule and host this conference today and tomorrow. Thanks to our distinguished guests and presenters for being flexible with their schedule. The aim of this conference is to engage in international dialogue going beyond the discussion of ideological aspect of the war. So as you can see from our program, we have speakers from US, South Korea, Hong Kong, and Canada. This is why we are having two of our sessions in the evening to accommodate different time zones. The presenters of this conference focus on the experience of human subjects, such as victimized women, civilians, and POWs during the Korean War. When commemorating the 70th year of the Korean War, we want to highlight new approaches to the international and social history of the war. Also, the conference will explore both external and internal impacts of the war and conclude with a roundtable discussion focusing on the legacy of the war and the outlook of the peace process on the Korean peninsula. Before I have the honor to introduce our distinguished guests, I would like to mention that KDI School of Public Policy and Management and the Sigur Center for Asian Studies at GW are co-sponsors of this conference. I truly appreciate their support. I'm extremely grateful to our three distinguished guests for agreeing to give their congratulatory remarks to open this conference despite their busy schedule this evening. Because our time is limited and our distinguished guests have extensive career that would be impossible to go over every one of them here, I would have to inevitably introduce a shorter version of their bios. Please refer to their full bios listed in the program. I would like to first introduce Interim Dean of the Elliot School of International Affairs at GW, Ilana Feldman. She is a historical anthropologist with regional expertise on the Middle East. She currently serves on the board of the Middle East Studies Association, is vice president of the board of the Palestinian American Research Center, is co-editor of a Cornell University Press book series titled Police Worlds, Studies in Security, Crime, and Governance, and is a member of the Advisory Council of ANERA, previously having served as a member of the board. Now, I would like to welcome Dean Feldman.
Thank you very much, Jisoo. So good evening, and I think good morning to some. It's very nice to be with you. It's really my pleasure to be with you here today at the GW Institute for Korean Studies conference commemorating the 70th anniversary of the outbreak of the Korean War. And this war has obviously left a tremendous impact, not only on the Korean Peninsula, but also the region and beyond, which continues to this day. So much research has been done on the topic of the legacy of the Korean War and the ways in which it remains a defining influence on the lives of the Korean people. I'm really happy to see that the GW Institute for Korean Studies has taken an innovative approach to examining underrepresented groups in studies of the Korean War. I'm sure that this virtual conference will help to connect people from around the world who seek a permanent peace on the Korean Peninsula. And I'd like to take a moment now to highlight the importance of the Korean Studies program at the Elliot School for International Affairs, particularly in the realm of public policy. The Institute for Korean Studies plays an important and enduring role providing the Washington, D.C. audience with a deep and broad perspective on all aspects of Korean studies in cooperation with leading experts. The Institute's mission to educate students who in the future will go on to influence policy, embark on careers in government, in academia, with think tanks, NGOs, and the media is essential. And I'd like to thank the KDI School of Public Policy and Management, KDIS, which is co-sponsor of the conference, along with the Sigur Center for Asian Studies, for providing a generous grant to the Institute for Korean Studies. As a result of this grant, the Institute has been able to host a series of meaningful career-related policy events, as well as to provide scholarships for GW students. And we at the LA School look forward to continued cooperation and even deeper exchanges with faculty and students of KDIS in the future. I'd like to thank the Korean ambassador to the US, Soo Hyuk Lee, for joining us today at this commemorative event. And also, thanks to Professor Kyung-Sik Jung of Seoul National University for participating in this year's conference as keynote speaker. We very much look forward to hearing from you. And finally, congratulations to the conference organizers for all your hard work in putting together the speakers and the participants in this conference. We look forward to the stimulating discussion that I know is to come. Thank you and have a wonderful conference.
Thank you so much, Ilana. Next speaker is Dean of KDI School of Public Policy and Management, Jung Yu. Dean Yu served as a member of the Public Funds Management Committee, the Advisory Committee for the Constitutional Revision Committee of the National Assembly, and the Commission on Financial Administration Reform. As a leader in civic movement, he is currently the head of Knowledge Cooperative for Good Governance, a network of researchers, and the president of Jubilee Bank, an NGO working to help debt-stricken low-income individuals. Although Dean Yu was not able to make live this evening, we appreciate him sending us a video to deliver his congratulatory remarks. We'll now turn on the video.
Distinguished guests, Professor Ilana Feldman, Interim Dean of Elliot School, His Excellency Lee Soo-hyuk, Ambassador of the Republic of Korea to the United States, Professor Kim Ji-soo, Director of the GW Institute for Korean Studies, Professor Jung Geun-sik, today's keynote speaker, moderators, presenters, commentators, and other experts. I sincerely thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedule to participate in today's virtual conference. KDI's GWIC's conference to commemorate the 70th anniversary of the Korean War. I would also like to thank the organizers for putting together this exciting and excellent program today, while coping with technical issues a virtual conference like this presents. Let me also take this opportunity to express my appreciation and admiration for the excellent work of GWICS, one of our key partners in the public diplomacy through education cooperation program. I'm sure that Ambassador Lee will agree when I say that the Korean government is quite happy with the progress our partnership between KDI School and GWICS has achieved over the last year and a half in terms of strengthening education and research in Korean studies at George Washington University and enhancing awareness and understanding of the Korea-related issues, both historical and contemporary, in Washington, D.C. Today's event is a good example of the kind of work our partnership has been carrying out. COVID-19 has disrupted all aspects of our lives, and international traveling has become almost impossible. Today's virtual conference is a testament to the fact that the partnership between KDI School and GWICS is strong enough to overcome the pandemic, travel restrictions, and other obstacles that may arise in the future. They say the Korean War is the forgotten war, perhaps so for the people outside Korea, but not so for Koreans. Like other Koreans of my generation, I heard and read so much about the tragic stories from the war as I was growing up. The deep scars of the war that tore apart the fabric of communities across the peninsula still remain, although 70 years have passed since the outbreak of the war. Moreover, technically speaking, the war is still not over, even after 70 years. The Korean War was put on hold by the Korean Armistice Agreement of 1953, and yet there has been no formal end to the war until now. This is not merely a technicality. The military tension and confrontation between the South and North are ominous reminders of the war yet to end formally. And the war still lives on in the minds of many on both sides of the peninsula. Their deep-seated distrust and hatred against each other have proven to be difficult challenges for the majority of people who harbor a fervent desire for peaceful coexistence and perhaps an eventual reunification. Everybody says that the Cold War ended 30 years ago. However, the Cold War did not end 30 years ago and has not ended yet as far as this part of the world is concerned. I do not dare to uncover the deep reasons for this unfortunate state of affairs, but simply note what an extraordinary folly this is. It is true that there have been many attempts to change the situation, starting from the July 4th Inter-Korean Joint Declaration in 1972. Notable achievements include the June 15th Joint Declaration in year 2000, following the first ever summit between the leaders of two Koreas, and the September 19th Pyongyang Joint Declaration during the summit between President Moon Jae-in and Chairman Kim Jong-un 2 years ago. We all remember the spectacular photos from the Trump-Kim summits. Unfortunately, however, all these initiatives ended in failures. Our hopes were dashed as quickly as they were raised. Is there really no hope? My worries are amplified because of a possibility of a new Cold War in which the US lines up South Korea and Japan against China, North Korea, and Russia. The growing conflicts between the US and China, including the escalation of the US sanctions against Chinese high-tech firms and the rising military tension in the South China Sea recently, is posing an enormous challenge for the Koreans. We really want to avoid having to take sides between the US and China, not only because of the economic and security cost-benefit calculations. It is also because a full solution to the nuclear crisis and the inter-Korea problems, including security guarantees to North Korea, is not possible without cooperation of the regional powers, especially China, as a party to the Korean Armistice Agreement of 1953. There is a need for a regional cooperation mechanism in Northeast Asia, in which the US and China participate side by side. I am told that the US and China cooperated to eradicate polio in the 1960s at the height of the Cold War. They must again cooperate to fight the COVID-19 pandemic, including development, production, and distribution of vaccines. We need to find ways to reap the benefits of cooperation even when we are in conflict in other areas. I hope that the US and China can exhibit the wisdom to do so in finding ways for a peaceful resolution of the Korea problem. 70 years is a long time, too long for a war to persist. We must hurry and put a formal and final end to the Korean War. I am aware of the enormous, seemingly insurmountable obstacles. But we must find a way. We need creative, out-of-box thinking and courageous and extraordinary actions. The first step for doing so, I believe, is to question the conventional assumptions and the accepted facts. I hope today's conference will be such a step, a successful one, and look forward to the presentations and discussions. Finally, I'd like to thank you all once again for joining us today. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Dean Yu. Our next speaker is His Excellency Soo-hyuk Lee, Ambassador of the Republic of Korea to the United States. Ambassador Lee is an experienced diplomat and former legislator. He has served as Korean Ambassador Extraordinary and Plenipotentiary to the United States since October 2019. Prior to his appointment, Ambassador Lee served as a member of the 20th Korean National Assembly, where he was a member of the Foreign Affairs and Unification Committee, and endowed chair, professor at Dankook University in Seoul, and first deputy director of the National Intelligence Service. He was previously the ambassador to Germany, deputy minister for political affairs at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade, ambassador to the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, and minister counselor at the Korean Embassy in the United States. He has twice been awarded the Order of Service Merit. Please welcome Ambassador Lee.
Good evening, Washington, D.C. or United States and Canada, and good morning, in Seoul and Hong Kong. Thank you for asking me to join you today. It's my pleasure to speak to you as part of our commemoration of the 70th anniversary of the outbreak of the Korean War. To begin, I'd like to thank our host, the George Washington University Institute of Korean Studies, the Sigur Center for Asian Studies, and the KDI School of Public Policy and Management for organizing today's event. We are incredibly grateful for your continued support in studying and promoting the importance of Korean-US alliance. 70 years ago, young men and women from all over the United States responded to a call to go to Korea and defend their country, who knew, and the people they had never met. During the war, men and women and the uniforms of the United States and Korea fought shoulder to shoulder for the sake of freedom. Then their sacrifices created a sense of unbroken comradeship. Our alliance was forged in the crucible of the war. Today's conference will discuss the war as a lived experience. At the time of the outbreak of the Korean War, I myself was a 1.5-year baby. Thus, I have few specific memories of the war. When I joined the primary school, it was 3 years after the armistice agreement was signed. Back then, my school building was half demolished, and that image of the school is still vivid in my memory. The war has been in the background of everything I have done since, both personally and professionally. As a young man, I witnessed the recovery from the scars of the war, our economic growth, the miracle of the Han River, and our flourishing democracy. Professionally, the pursuit of peace on the Korean Peninsula and strengthening the US and Korea alliance has been major themes of my diplomatic career. Indeed, I was the first chief negotiator for the six-party talks in 2003, and now as the Korean ambassador to the United States, I devote myself every day to deepening our bilateral alliance. The linchpin of peace and security in the Korean Peninsula as well as Northeast Asia. It is clear that our alliance has proven its ability to stand the test of time. Together, we have shared experiences, shared values, and shared interests, and we will continue that partnership working together across the board to create an even more comprehensive strategic alliance. In the past, our alliance was primarily about security cooperation. Our militaries successfully worked together to preserve peace and to allow prosperity to develop on the Korean Peninsula. In more recent years, however, the alliance has moved beyond security, first by embracing economic cooperation, and today to include vibrant cultural cooperation, people-to-people exchanges, and more. Today, Korea stands as a robust partner with the United States in every aspect. We share values like democracy and market economy. We learn from each other and appreciate each other's contributions. Ultimately, the progress is achieved because of the sacrifices that the United States veterans made for freedom and democracy 70 years ago. Thanks to their contributions, Korea is now one of the most flourishing economy and stable democracy in the world, as well as a close partner of the United States. One of the great honors for me as ambassador is to have opportunities to meet these veterans and express our thanks and gratitude for their service. At the end of July, I was honored to attend the commemorative ceremony with the President of the United States. A small group of veterans could safely gather at the Korean War Memorial on the National Mall, and we pay tribute to the fallen heroes that day. As ambassador and as a Korean, I am incredibly proud of our bilateral alliance, and I will always work to preserve and strengthen it. Our response to the ongoing pandemic is a case in point. From early on, Korea and the United States have worked together to cope with and defeat the virus. When the virus first hit Korea early this year, the United States provided us with significant support to help us fight the first wave, and our efforts proved remarkably successful. When the virus moved on and came to the United States, Korea helped to supply the United States with testing kits and medical equipment to help the US flatten the curve. We are still assisting each other, including by sharing our experience on how to run an election during the pandemic, as Korea successfully did it in April. This cooperation is one more step closer in our relationship and the next step for another 70 years of peace and prosperity together. Once again, congratulations on today's event, and I hope that the experience and the insights we share today become another stepping stone for our future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Lee. We appreciate your effort in strengthening US-ROK alliance. Thank you so much. Now, I would like to again express my appreciation once again to all of our distinguished guests. Now we will move on to our keynote speaker, Professor Jung. Before I introduce him, I would like to ask our audience to submit your questions using the Q&A feature. I'll be collecting them as they come in and ask during the Q&A session after his speech. Since 2003, Professor Jung has been teaching at the Department of Sociology, Seoul National University. He was a director of the Institute of Peace and Unification Studies at SNU from 2016 to 18, and a director of Korean Democracy Institute under the Korea Democratization Foundation from 2009 to 12. His current research focuses on the POWs during the Korean War and the strategic villages in the division border area. The title of his talk is The Legacy of Korean War and Overcoming the Cold War Division Regime from Multi-Layered Approach. Without further ado, I'll now turn it over to Professor Jung.
Hello, all of my friends. My name is Jung. It's a great for me to participate and to give a talk in this significant meeting. As you know, the important days of Korean history of democracy, war, and peace have been marked this year. This year has seen the 60th anniversary of the April Revolution and the 40th anniversary of the May 18 and in Gwangju, and both are crucial date of the Korean history of democratization. This year also marked 70 years since the outbreak of the Korean War and 20 years since the North-South Joint Declaration. These commemorations have all come at once in this same year. Earlier this year, the Korean government created the project committee for the 70th anniversary of the Korean War. This committee adopted the slogan, Remembrance, Together, Peace, and invited Korean war veterans from abroad as a main program. However, the global pandemic forces a change of the plans. Instead of inviting Korean war veterans, so the committee, co-chairman, the Prime Minister, decided to send out 1 million face masks. The Korean government dispatched half of them to the United States and the other half of them to the other countries. In recent year, the commemoration event has been held in South Korea on July 7th. However, somewhat strangely, they commemorate the participation of United Nations forces in the war. Not the war itself, From 1950 to 1975, the South Korea set aside October 24th as a UN Day. This celebration was abolished in the 1976. Then, 2013, the Park administration designated July 27th as a commemoration of United Nations participation in the Korean War. This event has been observed every year since then, and this year has been no exception. Today, I want to examine the legacy left by the Korean War through the concept of the Korean War division regime and investigate the conditions for peace. The Korean War and its legacy unfolded and beyond the national level. So I will try to take a multi-layered approach that includes the three scales: regional, national, and local. More concretely speaking, for the Korean studies, it could be 5 scales, including global, regional, large national, small national, and local. When we look back on the modern history of Korea, from the perspective of the Korean War's 70th anniversary, it seems to be a story of a great war followed by the small, unstable peace. The righteous violence, the great Mahen Gewalt in Walter Benjamin's word of World War II introduced a new world order, including liberation and division in Korea. Division was a high prices for Korea to pay for its liberation. And the next step of a division was military war between two Koreas. We need to remember that Korean War, as well as being a civil war on the Korean peninsula, was an international war in East Asia. Later, the Korean War taught us how difficult the unification through the military forces was. And we paid for the lesson with consolidation of the division regime. Furthermore, it structured not only North Korea, United States hostility, but also Chinese, United States hostility and China's own division. After the Korean War, along with the 3 separate treaties signed by the United States with Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan, formed the basic framework for the Southern Trilateral Alliance that instituted the Cold War division regime in East Asia. The corresponding Northern Trilateral Alliance was established after the Chinese army withdrew from the North Korea in 1958. The North Korea signed separate treaties with the Soviet Union and China in 1961. In short, the East Asian Cold War division regime is a complex network of hostilities and alliance among nations. The asymmetric division of the Korean peninsula and the asymmetric division of China are the core elements. On this structural basis, the United States-China relationship is the axis of order and the social change in East Asia. This axis of regional order can be divided into 4 phases: confrontation, reconciliation, cooperation, and now the competitive conflict. The Korean War legacy can be classified in terms of its positive and negative effect for nation building. On the plus side, it provided both Koreas with mobilization power and managerial capacity. A large part of the Korean War's negative legacy was a host of the humanitarian issue: separate families, disabled soldiers, refugees, orphans, and widows. In addition, the war firmly rooted anti-communism and anti-North Korean sentiment in the South Korean society. The United States' role in post-war reconstruction process then led to the emotional, economic, and the military dependence on the United States. It is worth remembering that by around 1955, the United States economic and military aid to South Korea reached somewhere around $1 billion each year. There are some sentiments insistent with United States dependency. But it took a considerable amount of time of this feeling to be expressed. Security tension first emerged, I think, in 1958. In this year, the United States, suffering from a fiscal deficit, reduced aid and began using tactical nuclear weapons to ensure the security. When the Vietnam War broke out in 1960s, the East Asia Cold War became very hot indeed. Under the Nixon doctrine of the United States began to the serious pursuit of better relationship with China. The United States replaced Taiwan at the United Nations with China. It also withdrew the one military division from South Korea and requested inter-Korean dialogue to ease tensions. Whether there was a security crisis in Korea during this period is a live issue. However, clear differences in position surrounding Korean politics was obstructed by the 1971 presidential election. This election, famous for the confrontation between Park Chung-hee and Kim Dae-jung, was a crossroad in the reproduction of a Cold War division regime that fostered security and the restoration of democracy. From the clash at Panmunjom, 1976, South Korea and the United States began to deal with the security crisis through the joint military exercise such as Team Spirit. North Korea felt threatened by this, and whenever there was an opportunity, demanded it to be stopped. The next moment for changing in the East Asian Cold War division regime was China's reform in 1979. The establishment of United States-China diplomatic relations. It was President Carter who can push for withdrawal of United States troops from Korea, democratization of South Korea, and trilateral dialogue among two Koreas and the United States. But President Park Chung-hee strongly opposed the withdrawal of the United States troops and political liberalization. Carter even considered cross recognition of the two Koreas by the United States and China, but neither of the Koreas responded to this suggestion. Park did not wish to accept the change of order East Asian involvement in Carter's proposal and did not abolish the Union Constitution or Presidential Emergency Decree No. 9. So the Burma Democratic Uprising unfortunately led to the assassination of the Park Chung-hee. Analyzing the situation in 1979, we can see the changes at the level of the East Asia and those at the level of Korean Peninsula do not always coincide. And that for the transition of the Cold War division toward the stable space, conditions must be satisfied at different levels. Peace in East Asia requires United States-China cooperation, mutual trust between countries, and democracy in individual countries. South Korean society in the period of the 1979-80 may have lost even the slightest chance for peace thanks to rigid Cold War thinking and the absence of democracy. In 1980, however, all at the expense of the citizens of Gwangju, Korean society gained the critical say in the South Korea-United States alliance and the role of the US military in South Korea. The Cold War division regime is also implemented at the local level. The most important result of the Korean War was the boundary of division was changed from 38 line to the military demarcation line, and the DMZ was established, and the surrounding area became a restricted area for civilians. People were possibly relocated, and from 1967, iron force fences were installed in the DMZ, and the guard post became heavily fortified. Contrary to its name, the DMZ was now extremely militarized. In the West, In the west, the border area was mainly occupied and mainly guarded by the United States, while the South Korean army guarded the central and eastern area of the border. The military compound not only played a significant part in the post-war economy of South Korea, but also was a site where Korean women's lives changed dramatically. As the United States military withdrew in accordance with the Nixon Doctrine, a major change occurred in the military compound. Park's government carried out the large-scale camp cleanup project from 1971 to 1976 to maintain a military compound economy. And in central area of the border, some strategic villages has been established from 1968 to 1973. So we can see the Korean War's most significant legacy was a regime of division and that operated on regional, national, and local levels. Peoples who are living on national borders are particularly deeply affected. Let's turn our attention to asymmetric reconciliation and the dynamics of the post-Cold War regime. To help us understand what it is, how it formed, and what it means for reconciliation, we can start by considering the event of 1990 and 1992. These years were very important period for change, not only in world history, but also in East Asian history. Filled with confidence after the success of the Seoul Olympic, South Korea established diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union in 1990. Later, in 1991, nuclear weapons began to be withdrawn from South Korea, and both Koreas joined the United Nations. Just a few months after they joined, the two sides were able to sign the Inter-Korean Basic Agreement. Team spirit training was cancelled in 1992, and South Korea normalized relations with the former enemies China in August and Vietnam in December. The post-Cold War era in East Asia was realized. The withdrawal of the nuclear weapons and the cancellation of joint exercise between South Korea and United States helps diplomatic relationship between Korea and China. The closer diplomatic relationship and the resulting economic cooperation contribute to sustainable economic development in both countries. 1992 was an important year, not only for changes in Korea-China relations, but also for the relationship between Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese National Party. They agreed on the principle of one China, and this was a medium that enabled the reconciliation and cooperation. Despite this being the post-Cold War era, North Korea failed to normalize relations with the United States and Japan. So when their relations of mutual cooperation with socialist countries broke down, North Korea began to become isolated. An asymmetric reconciliation took place on the Korean peninsula. This gave rise to a long-term North Korean nuclear crisis, which began to function as a structural factor threatening the lasting peace on the Korean peninsula and in East Asia. What is the fundamental reason for the asymmetry? One is the North Korea nuclear program. The other is the United States mistrust with North Korea. In January 1993, the United States announced that team spirit training was going to resume, and followed through the 2 months later, North Korea promptly declared the withdrawal from the NPT. As the crisis between North Korea escalated, Carter visited Pyongyang in June 1994 to negotiate with Kim Il-sung. However, whilst preparing for the upcoming summit meeting with President Kim Jong-sam, Kim Il-sung died. The September 1994, the two United States Navy aircraft carriers and 33 ships gathered in the East Sea near Wonsan to attack a nuclear facility in Yongbyon. It was a serious situation, but in Geneva, the first North Korean nuclear crisis ended with a dramatic last-minute agreement between North Korea and the United States. With President Kim Dae-jung took office in 1998, the inter-Korean relations developed rapidly. Just after the start of the Mountain Kumgang project came the first inter-Korean summit in June 2000. This was a historical event holding possibilities for changing the Cold War division system on the Korean Peninsula, ending the inter-Korean hostilities created by the Korean War, and moving forward reconciliation and peace. At the summit, an outline of a possible inter-Korean peace system was drawn up, and the Kaesong Industrial Complex was created to be a pilot project for inter-Korean economic cooperation. However, unlike the 1979, the United States seems indifferent or actively opposed to the Kaesong complex. Why did the United States not encourage reconciliation between the two Koreas this time? It's a big question for me. To begin with, after the September 11th, the United States declared the war on terror, which had a negative effect on the flow of reconciliation between the two Koreas. Then, the October 2002, North Korea secretly admitted to Assistant Secretary of the State, James Kelly. This was the beginning of the second North Korean nuclear crisis. Democratization of Korean society was a driving force for the two transitional justice projects, post-colonial and post-Cold War, including the Truth and the Reconciliation Committee. This is a very important outcome, overcoming of the legacy of the Korean War. As you know, on April 5th, 2009, in the early days of the United States Obama government, North Korea ignored the warning from the international community and launched a long-range carrier rocket. Despite this, and contrary to expectation, the Obama government followed the policy of non-involvement towards North Korea, termed the strategic patient for 8 years. And during this period, North Korea's nuclear and missile capability increased significantly. Until 2017, in the light of North Korea's continued development of the nuclear weapons and missile, and with the United States and the UN continuing to place sanctions, the issue of the peace on the Korean Peninsula became more difficult. The variables that influenced the advance of peace on the Korean Peninsula and in East Asia from 2017 are first, withdrawal or reduction of United States troops and strategic weapons, and the suspension of reduction of joint military training exercise. Second, North Korea's development and the testing of nuclear and missile technology. Third, the arms race. The fourth, economic cooperation and cultural exchange between two Koreas. None of the international agreements reached during this period, such as the Geneva Covenant or the September 19 pledge made as six-party talks, lead to the institution of peace. We can say that the key cause is a lack of the trust between North Korea and the United States. Whilst China and Russia took the attitude that United States and South Korea joint military exercise and North Korea's nuclear testing and missiles activities should stop at the same time, the United States and North Korea both demanded that the other makes the first move towards the reconciliation. On November 2017, North Korea launched the Hwasong-15 in the intercontinental ballistic missile and declared that it had completed its mission to become a nuclear state. It became very apparent that North Korea's nuclear weapons and missiles are a threat to peace in the Korean Peninsula. But although no one would like to admit it, they also have some use as a way to facilitate dialogue. The 2017 North Korean crisis saw many South Koreans begin to value peace over unification. Pacifism began to find a place between nationalism and loyalty to the state, and the meaning of the unification began to be interpreted. In May 2017, the Democratic Party of Korea came to power in South Korea, but it was 7 months until the war crisis was resolved. What generated this new phase of Korean reconciliation and peace was a proposal to reduce South Korea-United States joint training exercise. After North Korea's participation in the Pyeongchang Olympics, the Inter-Korean Summit was held in Panmunjom. The main development was a statement that the two sides will actively cooperate to build a permanent and stable peace regime on the Korean Peninsula. They promised to declare an end to the war within this year, pursue talks, and move to the system of peace. Rather, the focus shifted to the 2018 discussion between North Korea and the United States in Singapore. In Singapore, they agreed to establish new bilateral relations of peace and prosperity, a sustainable and stable peace regime, and complete denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. 2 months later, on September 19th, President Moon Jae-in visited Pyongyang for an inter-Korean summit meeting. The North Korea and South also both agreed to completely stop all military hostilities. That promise that was kept until December 2018. When a second United States-North Korea summit was held in Hanoi, many expected this to be a turning point for peace on the peninsula. However, the talks produced no New Deal. It was a result neither the South nor the North expected. United Nations Security Council sanctions be lifted in exchange for the disposal of this nuclear facility. Looking at the situation in the 2018 and 2019, I became interested in Professor Jeon Dae-jung's concept of the imperfect sovereign state. The security and economic development of South Korea society after the Korean War was largely driven by the United States-South Korean alliance. However, following the asymmetric reconciliation, Koreans are often made aware of the disparity between Korea-China relations and United States-North Korea relations. It became apparent that South Korea could not make a big path to peace by herself after the failure of the Hanoi summit. It is therefore increasingly easy to sense the limitation of South Korean sovereignty or the decision-making power. Development of democracy in Korean society also means rising pressure to escape the limits of an imperfect sovereign state. There is, as such, ever wide reflexive thinking that the nature of the South Korea's alliance with the United States needs to be changed. The difficulty we face today stems from our inability to solve three problems simultaneously: the South Korea-United States alliance, and the North Korea's denuclearization project, and the future peace system. 국가부, who are working in the Gyeongnam University, has called this the trilemma and suggested keeping negotiation for denuclearization separate from the issue of what a future peace system would look like. In that sense, peace on the Korean Peninsula and in East Asia requires a different type of peace to what has gone before, a mutually recognized peace. This is a matter of acknowledgement each other, moving long-standing suspicions and building trust. It depends on whether the asymmetric post-Cold War that began in 1992 can be rehabilitated into symmetric post-Cold War. That entails the normalization of relations between North Korea and the United States, along with a peace agreement between the two Koreas. A key variable here is the maintenance of a cooperated relationship between the United States and China, the relationship which functions as the axis of a border in East Asia. When competition between the United States and China intensified and becomes conflict, peace on the Korean Peninsula and East Asia becomes difficult. Sustainability of the South Korea-United States alliance is a delicate issue. President Trump announced the reduction of United States-Korea military exercise shortly after the first United States-North Korea summit held in Singapore. But as a safety device for this, the United States Congress passed an act that restricted the reduction of United States forces in Korea through the Senate and House of Representatives for the first time. Moreover, the recent issue, USFK defense cost sharing, also raised question about the sustainability of the South Korea and United States alliance. The third variable is autonomy and activeness that South Korea can exert in the process of creating peace on the Korean Peninsula. At the two summits meeting, both Koreas promised exchange cooperation and implicitly agreed to prioritize the resumption of the mountain Gyeongbang tourism and the Kaesong Industrial Complex. However, due to the United States sanctions, this was not possible. Koreans are waiting for the signing of a peace agreement through the United States-North Korean summit, hoping for further progress in inter-Korean relations, and the United States is increasingly aware that South Korea is not taking an active role. In the past, President Moon Jae-in complied with the United States policy of maximum pressure on North Korea because he knew the previous South Korean effort for reconciliation had failed without the United States participation and agreement. But now, I think the President Moon Jae-in cannot wait any longer. There is no more time. Due to the unexpected breakdown of the Hanoi talks in February 2019, the clock of peace wound down and one path to reconciliation was blocked. However, in the face of global climate change, the disasters that have struck border areas, global pandemics such as COVID-19, common infectious disease, and the chronic food shortage in North Korea, we must strive to create a livable, stress-free community on the Korean Peninsula. For the future of the Korean Peninsula, the progress we have made toward peace must not be lost. Oh, thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much for your insightful view on the legacy of the Korean War. All right, without further ado, then I think I'll pass it on to Professor Greg Brzezinski.